On a January night in 1837, Catherine Brennan sat rigid in a chair tucked into the corner of a locked room at Sweetwater Plantation, a pen trembling between her fingers as a blank ledger page waited like an accusation. Across from her stood her husband, Nathaniel, his gray eyes hard and colorless as winter steel. He spoke to her in a voice that did not rise, did not soften, only instructed. What she was to watch, what she was to record, how she was to describe the body and the breath and the fear of the woman they had dragged inside. Her name was Ruth. She was 23 years old. She was terrified, and she had no choice in what was about to happen. Neither did Catherine. What began that night would continue for years, turning a Georgia plantation into something darker than the usual machinery of slavery, an organized, methodical cruelty disguised as improvement. It would pull in a doctor from Charleston with theories that treated people like stock. It would bind wealthy men together in a quiet network, trading children as if they were livestock. And it would lay a secret down into the soil at Sweetwater that would eventually consume everyone it touched. Before we go deeper, take a moment to subscribe to Liturgy of Fear and turn on notifications so you don't miss stories like this. And drop a comment telling us what state or city you're listening from. We read them, and it matters, because these stories didn't happen in a vacuum. They happened in places people still live. What Catherine witnessed that night was only the first turn of a wheel far more calculated than she could have imagined. Milledgeville served as Georgia's capital from 1804 to 1868. Red clay roads, white columned buildings, parlors thick with cigar smoke and political confidence. Men in tailored coats discussing crops and votes and inheritance as though the land itself were a ledger waiting to be balanced. 20 miles northeast, where the Oconee River cut through pine forests and low bottomland, Sweetwater Plantation stretched across 2,000 acres of cotton. The main house, federal-style, symmetrical facade, tall windows, sat on a slight rise, placed so Nathaniel Brennan could stand in the second-floor gallery and look out over everything that belonged to him. Nathaniel had inherited Sweetwater in 1832, at 28, along with 37 enslaved people and a reputation for cold efficiency. Just under 6 feet, lean and sharp-boned, he moved with the careful economy of a man who never wasted effort. His hands were always clean, nails clipped short, an unsettling contrast to the dirt-crescented fingers of other planters who still worked beside their field hands in the early years. Nathaniel never touched a plow. He studied ledgers. He read agricultural journals from Charleston and Savannah. He wrote letters to men who spoke of scientific farming and rational management of resources, as if the same principles that governed soil and seed could be cleanly applied to human life. Catherine Haywood became Catherine Brennan in May of 1834. She was 19. He was 30. The marriage joined 2 prominent Middle Georgia families. Her father owned a mercantile business in Milledgeville, fabric, farm equipment, household goods, everything plantation life required to keep its surface polished and its foundations hidden. Catherine had been educated at a finishing school in Augusta, unusual enough to draw attention. She could read Latin, play pianoforte, and keep household accounts with precision. Auburn hair, worn in the severe fashion of the era, pulled back from a face that portraits suggest was handsome rather than soft. Strong jaw, intelligent dark eyes that seemed to notice too much. Their first year passed pleasantly by the standards of planter society. Catherine managed the household servants, hosted dinners for Nathaniel's political connections, learned the rhythms that ruled the big house and the quarters. Beeswax and lavender in summer, wood smoke and cinnamon in winter. Like most plantation mistresses, she kept a garden of medicinal herbs. She learned what eased fever and what soothed the pains of childbirth for the enslaved women who had no access to proper doctors, no right to comfort unless it served the plantation's needs. But by their second anniversary, the absence of children had become a pressure that settled into every room. In a world that measured a woman's worth by her ability to produce heirs, Catherine's failure to conceive became something whispered at church socials and glanced at over teacups. Nathaniel never accused her outright, but she saw it in his tightening jaw when friends spoke of newborns and christenings, in the way he left the room whenever someone joked about the future patter of little feet at Sweetwater. In September of 1836, Nathaniel brought a doctor from Augusta to examine her. The man stayed 3 days. Catherine later described the examinations in her diary as humiliating beyond measure, a stripping away of dignity performed under the thin veil of medical necessity. The conclusion was delivered to Nathaniel in his study, while Catherine waited in the parlor like a child awaiting judgment. Some defect in her womb made conception impossible. The doctor used technical terms she did not understand, but the meaning came through with brutal clarity. She would never bear children. Catherine expected anger. She expected cruelty. What she received instead was something colder. Nathaniel thanked the doctor, paid him generously, and sent him back to Augusta as if closing a business transaction. That night, over dinner, he spoke almost casually about the reading he had been doing. Correspondence with men in Charleston. Theories being discussed under the respectable name of natural philosophy. Heredity, breeding, improvement. If Catherine could not give him an heir through natural means, he would pursue alternative methods. Methods, he assured her, were perfectly legal in Georgia. Widely practiced, though not widely discussed. Catherine understood at once what he meant. Planters often fathered children through enslaved women to increase their labor force without purchasing more people. Those children inherited their mother's status regardless of their father's race. Property begetting property. Some men kept it discreet, others were shameless. But Nathaniel's proposal was not the usual hypocrisy. It carried a different intention. He wanted her involved. He wanted her present. He wanted her to document everything. The first woman he selected was Ruth, 23, tall and strong from years in the fields. On a cold January night in 1837, Nathaniel had her brought to a room on the east side of the main house. It had once stored linens. Now it had been cleared and repurposed, stripped down to its essentials. He ordered Catherine to sit with her pen and paper, to observe and record Ruth's physical characteristics, her health, her demeanor, as if fear could be catalogued, as if violation could be made respectable by ink. Catherine's diary entry from that night was brief, the handwriting unsteady. God forgive me, I did as he commanded. I sat in the corner with pen and paper while my husband destroyed what remained of my dignity and Ruth's humanity. She did not cry out. I think that was the worst part, the silence. And the silence did not end. Over the following weeks, Catherine learned Nathaniel had been reading more than she understood. Agricultural journals, medical society papers, theories of selective breeding, ideas that would later be recognized for what they were. Pseudo-scientific racism dressed in the language of progress. The premise was simple, monstrous, and intoxicating to men like Nathaniel. Human beings could be improved through careful selection of breeding pairs, just as one bred horses or cattle for strength, speed, obedience. Nathaniel decided to conduct an experiment. Spring of 1837 brought unseasonable warmth to Baldwin County. Dogwoods bloomed early, filling the woods around Sweetwater with white blossoms that fell like snow when the wind moved through. Catherine walked among them one morning in late March, crushing petals beneath her boots, trying to find a fragment of peace in the natural world, because there was none inside her home. Ruth was pregnant. Catherine recognized the signs with a hollow, private ache, the very signs she had once prayed to see in herself. Nathaniel received the news with satisfaction and made a notation in a leather-bound book he kept separate from the plantation records. Catherine glimpsed it once on his desk. The pages were ruled into columns with headings that turned her stomach. Physical characteristics, estimated intelligence, projected value, disposition, breeding potential. Ruth was only the beginning. In April, Nathaniel selected Grace, only 19. In May, a woman named Dinah who worked in the kitchen. Each time, Catherine was required to be present, to watch, to record. She learned to dissociate, to slip her mind away from what her eyes were forced to witness. She focused on irrelevant details: a crack in plaster, the drone of night insects beyond the window, the smell of lamp oil burning low, anything but the steady, inevitable horror unfolding in that room. The enslaved people at Sweetwater knew what was happening. They could not know. The women who were selected moved through their work with hollowed eyes. The men, husbands, brothers, friends, carried rage that had nowhere safe to go, their faces carefully blank beneath the constant threat of violence or sale. The plantation's atmosphere shifted. The usual rhythms of coerced labor remained, but something darker hummed underneath now, a tension that threaded through every glance, every pause, every silence. And then, in July, a visitor arrived who would turn Nathaniel's private obsession into something systematic, something that felt less like secret sin and more like an institution being built. Dr. Cornelius Harrove came to Sweetwater on a Thursday afternoon, his carriage rattling up the oak-lined drive and trailing red dust. He claimed affiliation with the Medical Society of South Carolina in Charleston, though Catherine would later learn his credentials were murky at best. He was in his 50s, portly, mutton-chopped, with soft hands that looked unused to real labor. Over dinner, he explained his specialty with the confidence of a man who believed his words could cleanse his work. Anthropological medicine, the study of racial characteristics and their transmission through bloodlines. Nathaniel had been corresponding with him for months, ever since reading one of Harrove's papers in a Charleston medical journal. Observations on the hereditary transmission of physical and mental characteristics in the Negro race. It proposed that, through documentation and selection, planters could cultivate more valuable enslaved populations. Vile pseudoscience, printed in respectable ink, discussed by educated men in polished rooms as if they were advancing human knowledge. Harrove stayed at Sweetwater for 3 weeks that summer. He examined every enslaved person on the plantation. He measured skulls with brass calipers. He recorded hair texture, nose shape, eye color. He conducted what he called interviews, though there was nothing dignified about them. Questions designed to assess intelligence and temperament, followed by conclusions written in dense, scientific-sounding language. Catherine was required to assist him, to hold instruments, to write down measurements in the separate ledger he carried with him. She watched him work with a growing sickness in her throat. He showed particular interest in the children already at Sweetwater, measuring them with the same cold precision, predicting their future utility, as though they were crops in a field. In the evenings, Harrove and Nathaniel sat in the study with the door closed, their voices low, planning something larger than Catherine had feared. Harrove knew other planters, he said, men of vision. Men who understood the future of Southern prosperity lay in the scientific management of human property. A network could be formed, information shared, children with desirable characteristics traded or sold to continue breeding lines. It was Ruth who finally brought Catherine the truth that made the air in her lungs feel thin. One morning in late August, when Nathaniel and Harrove had ridden into Milledgeville for the day, Ruth appeared in the doorway of Catherine's morning room. 4 months pregnant, hands twisting together, fear written into her posture, but driven by something stronger than fear. "Mrs." Ruth whispered, "I need to tell you something about the babies, the ones that been born here before you came." Catherine's breath caught. She had assumed there were other children, fathered by Nathaniel or his father. It was common enough to be unspoken. But the way Ruth said it, her eyes, her voice, told Catherine this was not that. "Tell me," Catherine said, and heard how thin her own voice sounded. "Master Brennan, he'd been selecting certain babies," Ruth continued. "The ones with lighter skin, or different eyes, or other things Dr. Harrove looking for. After they born, after their mamas recover, men come in wagons at night, take the babies away, tell us they being sold, but they don't never say where. And when we ask folks at other plantations, nobody ever see them babies. They just gone." The room tilted. Catherine gripped the arm of her chair to steady herself. "How many?" she managed. "I don't know exacts. Maybe 20, 25 over the years. Started before old Master Brennan died. But it gotten more since Dr. Harrove started coming around." Catherine dismissed Ruth with a shaking hand and sat alone as sunlight crept across the floorboards. She thought of Nathaniel's ledger, its columns for projected value. She thought of Harrove's network, his calm talk of optimizing bloodlines. And she understood, with sudden, sick clarity, that Sweetwater was not simply producing more enslaved workers for profit. It was producing something else. Human children treated as experimental merchandise, distributed according to a grand design that existed only in the twisted logic of men who believed science could sanctify atrocity. That night, when Nathaniel returned, Catherine confronted him. It was the only time in their marriage she challenged him directly. She asked about the children, where they went, what he and Harrove were truly doing. Nathaniel looked at her for a long moment, his gray eyes cold in lamplight. Then he backhanded her across the face hard enough to split her lip. She struck the settee, tasted blood, and heard him speak in that same calm, reasonable tone, as if he were correcting a mistake in household management. "You will never question me again, Catherine. You are part of this now. Your observations, your records, they are essential to the work. You are complicit. And if you speak of this to anyone, if you try to interfere, I will have you committed to the Georgia Lunatic Asylum in Milledgeville. I have already spoken to a judge. One word from me, and you will spend the rest of your life in chains, treated as the mad woman you are threatening to become." Catherine wiped the blood from her mouth and said nothing. But something inside her shifted that night, quietly, like a final thread snapping. If she could not escape, if she could not expose him without being destroyed, then she would find another way. She would become something other than a victim. She would become an instrument, slow, careful, and deadly. The late summer storms came hard in 1837. Rain and lightning hammered the Georgia Piedmont. Cotton rotted in fields across Baldwin County. Planters gathered in Milledgeville with tight voices, worrying over yields and markets. Nathaniel played the part of concerned neighbor while his attention remained fixed on his experiment. Weather could not interrupt his work. Grace gave birth in September to a boy with unusually light skin, eyes that would settle into a gray-green shade. Herove was present for the delivery, examining the infant like a specimen, making notations as the mother lay emptied and shaking. Nathaniel was pleased. Within a week, men came in the night, as Ruth had said they would. Catherine watched from an upstairs window as a bundle was lifted into a covered wagon and carried away toward the south road. Grace was given 2 days to recover, then sent back to the fields, moving like something broken, breasts bound beneath her dress, eyes fixed on nothing. And somewhere inside Catherine, the first cold outlines of a plan began to harden into shape. Catherine had begun her own record by then. While Nathaniel and Herove kept their official ledgers, clean lines, confident headings, Catherine started a secret diary meant for something else entirely. It did not pretend neutrality. It did not pretend that ink could make this orderly. She wrote the women's names, their children's names when she could learn them. Approximate dates. Small identifying details she could not bear to lose. An infant's strange eyes, a birthmark on a shoulder, the way a mother held her breath as if holding it could sense she recorded which children disappeared, and she tried to find patterns in the vanishing. Which features drew Nathaniel's attention? Which births made Herove's voice soften with interest? Which infants were spoken of in that clinical tone that meant a wagon would come? She also returned to her garden with a new kind of purpose. Catherine had always kept medicinal herbs. It was expected. A planter's wife who could soothe fevers and settle stomachs was considered competent, even virtuous. But now she read her mother's books differently, not as guides to comfort, but as maps to power. She studied plants that did not announce themselves all at once, substances that worked gradually, cumulatively, illness that could look like fate. Foxglove grew wild in the woods around Sweetwater, beautiful, bell-shaped, almost delicate. In small doses, it could strengthen a failing heart. In slightly larger doses, given regularly, it could cause weakness, confusion, nausea, slow damage that hid behind ordinary complaints. To poison someone without detection required patience and precision. Catherine had both. In October, Ruth gave birth to a girl. This baby had darker skin and more typical features. Nathaniel's interest cooled as soon as he saw her. Herove examined the child anyway, made his notes, and spoke with a tone that suggested she was less valuable to their aims. No men came in the night for this baby. Ruth was allowed to keep her. She named her Martha. Catherine felt something obscene and sharp in her chest, a relief so small it barely deserved the name, because remaining with her mother still meant a life of enslavement at Sweetwater. But at least for now, the child would not vanish into the dark. Diner's labor came in November and went badly. The baby, a boy, was born dead. Diner hemorrhaged. Catherine tried to stop the bleeding with everything she knew. Pressure, herbs, cloths, whispered instructions, hands that would not stop shaking. It was not enough. Diner died 3 days later, her body cooling in a cramped quarter while the plantation continued around her like a machine that could not afford to pause. Catherine cleaned the blood from Diner's room herself. She scrubbed until her knuckles ached, not because she was kind, but because guilt demanded something to do, something physical, something that felt like penance even though she knew it wasn't. She had watched Diner be selected. She had sat in that locked room and documented the violation with obedient ink. And now Diner was dead. Catherine vomited in a bucket in the laundry room. Then she washed her face, composed her features, and returned to the main house as if nothing had happened. Weakness was not permitted at Sweetwater, not from the enslaved, and not from the mistress trapped above them. Nathaniel seemed more irritated than grieving. He had invested time and resources in Dinah's pregnancy, and the result was nothing. He made a notation in his ledger: complications to avoid, failures to study. Harrove suggested examining the body to determine the cause, but Nathaniel overruled him. The enslaved community needed at least the pretense of respect for their dead, he said. Morale, efficiency, the smooth functioning of the machine. They buried Dinah behind the quarters in the small cemetery marked by wooden crosses and rough stones. Catherine attended, standing apart as the enslaved people sang hymns in low voices that seemed to carry more sorrow than sound. Ruth held baby Martha close. Grace stood like a ghost among the living, eyes empty, hands limp at her sides. Pearl moved among the women with careful attention, her face composed in a way Catherine recognized, vigilance disguised as calm. Catherine felt their hatred aimed at her as much as at Nathaniel, and she could not blame them. She was part of this house. She lived on its profits. She had been present. She had written. She was complicit. But she was preparing. Each week, she collected small foxglove leaves from the woods, careful not to strip any one plant too bare. She dried them in a hidden place, crushed them to powder, and measured out tiny amounts with the same precision she used to balance household accounts. Then, when Nathaniel poured his evening whiskey, she added just enough to make his body begin to fail. Nothing dramatic, nothing that would call for a doctor, only a steady erosion. She told herself it was justice. The truth was more tangled than that. It was rage and fear and guilt so heavy it made her chest feel bruised. It was the desperate need to reclaim some sliver of control in a house where she had been reduced to a witness with a pen. Winter came early that year. By December, frost killed the last of her garden plants. Catherine collected foxglove seeds and stored them for spring. She had learned patience. Revenge, she understood now, was not a single act. It was a slow campaign, carried out in silence, measured in weeks and months. Harrove returned for Christmas, bringing documents he and Nathaniel studied in the locked study. Catherine did not know what those papers contained, but she could feel their weight in the house. She imagined a web spreading outward. Other plantations, other men, children moved like pieces on a board. The language of science draped over it like a clean cloth thrown over something rotting. On Christmas Eve, the enslaved people were given a holiday, as was customary. They gathered in the quarters, singing and trying to find moments of joy where joy should not have been possible. Catherine watched from the main house window. Ruth swayed with baby Martha. Grace stood alone at the edge of the group, staring at nothing, her body present but her spirit somewhere far away. Catherine turned from the window and poured herself a glass of wine. Her hands were steady now. She felt she had passed beyond horror into something colder. Not peace, not acceptance, something like resolve. The new year of 1838 arrived with freezing rain that turned roads to mud and trapped everyone within the boundaries of Sweetwater. Nathaniel and Harrove spent long hours planning the expansion of their project. Catherine spent hers documenting everything in her hidden diary and continuing the slow poison. Foxglove began to show its work. Nathaniel complained of fatigue, occasional nausea, a vague malaise he blamed on the winter. No doctor was called. Why call a doctor for something so small? Catherine smiled at him over breakfast and asked if he wanted more coffee. He did. She poured it carefully and watched him drink it down, her face composed, her heart hammering quietly beneath her ribs. What do you think Catherine should do? Could you maintain the same composure in her situation? Let us know in the comments. And if this story is pulling you in, hit like and share it with someone who appreciates dark historical tales. March of 1838 brought false spring to Middle Georgia. Warm days coaxed buds from fruit trees before late frosts killed them. The air smelled briefly of renewal, but it was a lie, just as the plantation's polished surface was a lie. Nathaniel's decline continued. He moved more slowly now. He complained of weakness in his limbs and a fog in his thoughts. Catherine suggested a doctor in Milledgeville, but he refused. Pride would not let him admit vulnerability. He insisted it was simply winter lingering in his bones. Harrove noticed during an April visit. He examined Nathaniel in the study, Catherine not present for once, and emerged looking faintly concerned. Reduced activity, better nutrition, perhaps a tonic. He wrote a prescription to be filled at an apothecary in town. Catherine collected it, filled it, and brought it back as any dutiful wife would. But she also reduced her foxglove doses. She did not want Nathaniel dead yet, not quickly, not cleanly. She wanted him weak, dependent, slowed, unable to drive his program with the same cold vigor. She wanted him to feel his body betray him the way he had stolen control of others' bodies. She wanted him to suffer long enough to understand that suffering could be calculated. Her careful plan was complicated by a new development. 2 women were pregnant again, Ruth for a second time, and Pearl, the chambermaid in the main house. Pearl was 26, educated by previous owners who had taught her to read before economic troubles forced them to sell her south. She was intelligent, observant, and Catherine had long noticed the way Pearl watched everything, quietly collecting details, storing them away as if information itself were a weapon. Catherine began to feel a strange kinship with her, though it could never be named aloud. Both were trapped in Sweetwater's nightmare. Both were documenting it in their own ways. Both were waiting for something to shift. When they passed in hallways, Pearl's eyes would meet Catherine's for the briefest moment. Communication without words. Not trust, not yet, but recognition. It was Pearl who finally told Catherine about Samuel. One morning in late April, when Nathaniel and Harrove had ridden into Milledgeville for a meeting with other planters, Catherine found Pearl alone in the laundry room, washing linens in water gone gray with soap. Catherine sent the other workers away on pretended errands and waited until she and Pearl were truly alone. "I know you've been watching," Catherine said quietly. "I know you see everything that happens here, the way I do. And I know you understand what my husband is doing." Pearl's hands stilled in the water. She looked at Catherine, assessing, calculating risk, the way a person does when the cost of the wrong choice can be catastrophic. Then, after a long moment, she spoke carefully. "What is it you want to know, Mrs.?" "Everything you think I should know," Catherine said. "Everything that might help me stop this." Pearl glanced toward the door again. Then she leaned closer, lowering her voice to something barely audible. "There's something Master Brennan kept hidden from you. A boy. His name is Samuel. He was born 8 years ago before you came here. His mama was Judith. She worked in the house. Master Brennan kept Samuel because he was the first one born looking almost white. Gray eyes, light hair like his own. Judith got sold away to Alabama when Samuel was weaned, and the boy been living in a cabin apart from the rest of us ever since." Ice spread through Catherine's chest. "Why have I never seen him?" she whispered. "Master Brennan keeps him separate. He teaches him things. Reading, writing, arithmetic, history, things he don't allow the rest of us to learn. I heard him and Dr. Harrove talking about the boy. They say Samuel is proof their theories work." Pearl's voice dropped even lower, as if the words themselves could be punished. "And they planning to use him. When he gets older, when he reaches manhood, they plan to have him father children himself. They want a whole line of people who look white, but still property under the law. People they can sell for fortunes to buyers who want servants that can pass in white society." The horror struck Catherine like a physical blow. A child molded into an instrument of the same violation that had created him. A legacy engineered to reproduce itself across generations. A system that did not end with one man's appetite, but extended into the future like a disease. "Where is he kept?" Catherine asked. "In a cabin on the east side of the property, past the barn. Master Brennan visits most afternoons for lessons." Pearl paused, eyes narrowing with something that looked like grim certainty. "But Mrs. Samuel's smart. Real smart. He understands what he is, what Master Brennan plans. I seen the look in that boy's eyes. He angry, and he waiting for something." Catherine left the laundry room with Pearl's words echoing through her like a bell that would not stop ringing. Samuel. A son Nathaniel had fathered, hidden, trained, kept like a private triumph and a future tool. Catherine needed to see him, to understand what 8 years under Nathaniel's instruction had created, to know whether the boy was merely a victim being shaped or something else. Something dangerous. That evening at dinner, Catherine took a calculated risk. She mentioned, with practiced casualness, that she had heard there was a child at Sweetwater receiving an education. How unusual that seemed. Nathaniel's fork paused halfway to his mouth, his eyes fixed on her with sudden sharpness. "Where did you hear that?" "Servants' talk," Catherine said, her tone light. "I pay attention to my household." Nathaniel set his fork down with deliberate care. "Samuel is part of the project," he said calmly. "An experiment in potential. He demonstrates what careful selection and proper training can produce." "I would like to meet him," Catherine said. "No." Catherine held his gaze. "I have been present for every other aspect of this work. I have documented births, recorded characteristics, witnessed things that will haunt me until I die. Why should I not meet this child who is apparently so important to your vision?" The silence stretched between them like a wire pulled tight. Catherine could see him calculating, measuring whether her request posed a threat. His illness had made him more cautious, less certain of absolute control. Finally, he nodded once. "Tomorrow afternoon," he said. "But you will observe only. You will not speak to him unless I permit it, and you will not interfere with his education." The next day dragged with anticipation that bordered on dread. Catherine moved through her morning tasks mechanically, her mind fixed on the coming meeting. When Nathaniel finally came to collect her after midday, she followed him across the yard toward a cabin set apart from the quarters. It was better built than the others. Glass windows instead of shutters, a small porch with real steps. Inside, the space was spare but clean. A narrow bed, a table with 2 chairs, shelves of books Catherine recognized from Nathaniel's library. And at a small desk near the window sat a boy working arithmetic problems on a slate, handwriting neat and precise. Samuel looked up when they entered. Catherine's breath caught. The resemblance to Nathaniel was unmistakable in the angular face, the set of the jaw, the pale gray eyes. But the boy's skin was lighter than Catherine expected. Light enough that, in different clothes, in a different place, he might pass unquestioned in white society. His hair was brown with gold undertones, falling across his forehead as he studied them. "Samuel," Nathaniel said, with a tone that carried something almost like pride. "This is Mrs. Brennan." The boy stood smoothly and bowed with formal correctness. "Good afternoon, Mrs. Brennan," he said. Diction perfect, no dialect, every trace of it trained away. "It is good to meet you, Samuel," Catherine managed. For the next half hour, Nathaniel displayed Samuel like prized evidence. The boy read passages beyond what most 8-year-olds could handle. He solved mathematical problems with ease. He answered questions about history and geography with unsettling accuracy. And through it all, his face remained a mask, revealing nothing. When they left and crossed the yard back toward the main house, Nathaniel spoke with barely contained satisfaction. "You see," he said, "proof. The theories are sound. With proper breeding and education, exceptional results are possible. In another 10 years, when he reaches maturity, he will be ready for the next phase." "What next phase?" Catherine asked, though cold certainty was already forming in her gut. "He will father children of his own," Nathaniel said. "I have been corresponding with Callaway about potential matches. There are plantations with girls from similar programs. We will pair them based on optimal characteristics. Samuel's children will represent the culmination of everything we have learned." Catherine stopped walking. "You're planning to use your own son as breeding stock." Nathaniel did not even blink. "He is not my son in any legal sense," he said calmly. "He is property, exceptionally valuable property, and he will fulfill the purpose for which he was created. It is no different than using a prize bull to improve one's cattle." "He is a child," Catherine said, her voice tight. "A human child." Nathaniel's expression hardened. "He is a tool in a grand experiment. Do not allow yourself to become sentimental, Catherine. Sentiment has no place in scientific progress." That night, Catherine sat with her hidden diary open before her and could not write. The horror of what Nathaniel planned for Samuel seemed to dwarf even the other atrocities. This was not simply exploitation. It was the construction of a self-perpetuating machine of abuse, designed to continue, to replicate itself, to become a lineage of trauma engineered by men who called it progress. She had to stop it. But how? Nathaniel held the power. The law belonged to him. Even if she helped Samuel escape, where would an almost white enslaved child go? How would he survive in a world that demanded clear categories and punished anyone who blurred them? And then the answer came, simple and terrible. She needed an ally with real power, someone whose moral authority carried weight, someone from outside the plantation system, someone with connections beyond Georgia. She needed a minister. The Reverend Thomas Gaines arrived in Milledgeville in early August, assigned to the Presbyterian Church by the Northern Synod. 35, unmarried, a graduate of Princeton Theological Seminary. The local congregation would soon learn he held dangerously progressive views on slavery. Not abolitionist exactly, too careful for that. But he preached about Christian duty, about all people as children of God, about the spiritual corruption of absolute power. Catherine attended his first sermon from the Brennan family pew, listening as he spoke on the Good Samaritan with an emphasis that made several plantation owners shift uncomfortably. After the service, she approached him in the receiving line, introduced herself with perfect propriety, and said she would value his counsel on difficult spiritual matters. Reverend Gaines had intelligent brown eyes that seemed to see more than people wanted revealed. "I would be honored, Mrs. Brennan," he said. "Shall I call at Sweetwater?" "That would be most appropriate," Catherine replied, aware of Nathaniel watching from across the church lawn. "My husband and I would be pleased to receive you." And with those polite words, a fragile doorway opened, one that might lead out of Sweetwater's nightmare, or deeper into it. The minister's first visit came the following Tuesday. Catherine had prepared carefully, arranging everything so Nathaniel would be present, so nothing about the meeting could be construed as improper or secretive. They sat in the front parlor, sunlight filtered through lace curtains, tea steaming gently between them. Theology, church matters, polite abstractions. Nathaniel listened with a thin smile, his posture rigid, his breathing slightly labored now even at rest. When Reverend Gaines asked if he might tour the plantation to better understand the lives of his potential congregants, Catherine felt the moment open like a seam. Nathaniel could hardly refuse without drawing suspicion, so he agreed, his reluctance thinly veiled. Catherine led the way. Nathaniel followed a few paces behind. They passed the slave quarters at an hour when people were visible. Ruth stood holding Martha, now sturdy enough to grasp at her mother's collar. Grace lingered at her cabin door, her expression unchanged, eyes empty of reflection. Pearl moved between buildings, her pregnancy evident now, her movements careful, deliberate. "You have a large population here," Reverend Gaines observed. His tone was neutral, but his eyes lingered. On the women, on the children, on the way bodies carried tension even at rest. "Sweetwater is prosperous," Nathaniel replied. "We manage our resources efficiently." "Resources," the minister repeated softly. "Yes, I suppose that is one way to describe people." The air tightened. Nathaniel's jaw flexed, but he said nothing. They finished the tour and returned to the house. Reverend Gaines took his leave with promises to return soon. After his carriage vanished down the drive, Nathaniel turned to Catherine. "What are you doing?" "Seeking spiritual guidance," she replied evenly. "You have made me party to many things, Nathaniel. My conscience requires counsel." "Be careful," he said. "Very careful." But Reverend Gaines did return, again and again. Sometimes Nathaniel sat in on their discussions, silent and watchful. Other times his fatigue kept him upstairs, and Catherine met with the minister alone in the parlor, Pearl serving tea. Her presence a quiet reminder of what was truly being discussed. Catherine never spoke directly of the breeding program. She asked questions instead, about complicity, about obedience, about what a Christian must do when law sanctifies evil. Reverend Gaines answered with care, but Catherine saw recognition dawning. He began to ask his own questions, gentle, indirect, about children born at Sweetwater, about their fathers, about those who did not remain. In mid-September, Pearl went into labor. It came hard and fast, the pain folding her inward, her hands gripping the bed frame until her knuckles whitened. Catherine attended the birth, as she did all of them now. After 6 hours, a baby girl was born, lighter-skinned than Pearl, darker than Samuel. Catherine wrapped the child and placed her in her mother's arms. "Her name is Grace," Pearl said hoarsely, "after the one who lost everything." Catherine looked at her, this woman who watched and recorded, who took risks in silence, who had just brought a child into a world that might steal her before nightfall. "I will not let them take her," Catherine said quietly, "whatever it costs me." That night, Nathaniel came to inspect the child, ledger in hand. He made his usual notations. Catherine followed him to the study. "This one stays," she said. "That is not your decision. It is now." Her voice did not shake. "If you take her, I will go to Reverend Gaines and tell him everything. Names, dates, Callaway, Harrove, all of it." Nathaniel stared at her. His illness had thinned him, slowed him, and Reverend Gaines had changed the balance in ways neither of them could ignore. "One child," Nathaniel said finally. "That is all." "And no more women selected," Catherine pressed. "No more." The silence between them stretched. Nathaniel did not agree, but he did not refuse. 2 days later, Reverend Gaines arrived unannounced. "I have made inquiries," he said once they were alone. "What happens here is part of something larger." Catherine told him everything. He listened without interruption. When she finished, he said, "We must move carefully, but we must move." Plans were made. Documentation would be copied, passed quietly, sent beyond Georgia. 2 days after that, Nathaniel confronted her. "You have been feeding the minister information," he said, gripping her wrist. "You will cease all contact." "Or what?" Catherine asked calmly. He released her, furious but uncertain. That evening, Samuel appeared at the kitchen door and pressed a folded paper into Pearl's hand. "I know what my father plans for me. I want to help stop him. I can carry messages." Samuel became their courier, an 8-year-old boy, moving knowledge through the house that believed it owned him. The crisis came in mid-October. Nathaniel found one of the messages. Samuel knelt in the dirt, blood at his lip. Nathaniel raged. The overseer was sent to fetch Dr. Phillips from Milledgeville. "My wife has become hysterical," Nathaniel said. "She requires confinement." Catherine stepped forward. "I have documentation," she said quietly, "and copies are already in other hands." Pearl stepped forward too, baby Grace in her arms. "We have records," she said. "If you silence her, the truth will still come out." Nathaniel looked at the gathered faces, at Samuel, at Catherine. "What do you want?" he asked. "I want it to stop," Catherine said, "completely." The standoff ended not with justice, but with surrender. The breeding stopped. No more children were taken. Samuel's freedom was written into Nathaniel's will. They lived in stalemate after that. A cold war inside Sweetwater's walls. Nathaniel's health declined. The foxglove had done its work. By 1843, he was dead. Catherine felt only relief. She lived on, managing Sweetwater as humanely as slavery allowed, which was never enough. She freed Pearl and Grace. Samuel left Georgia and never returned. Ruth stayed. Catherine died in 1854. Her records were sealed for a century. When they were opened, they told a story no one wanted to hear, but could not deny. Sweetwater burned. The land was forgotten, but the truth remained. And that is where this part of the story ends.